Okay, English 373, week one, part four. I forgot to do some technical stuff I probably should have done. My office hours are going to be Fridays from 11:30 to 2, and I'm going to do that over, I don't know, Zoom, I guess. I haven't quite figured out Zoom. I mean, I figured it out, but I fucked something up last year when I got my Zoom account. I got like a regular person Zoom account. I needed to get a professional account, and I got in this horrible internet loop that I'm sure some of you have dealt with, where it's like when I got the regular account, it locked me out of the ability to get the pro account because I should have gotten a pro account through the school when I started, and instead I got the personal account because I was like, this pandemic's not going to last that long. Anyway, I'll figure out office hours, but they're going to be Fridays from 11 to 2. And whatever, you can fucking call me or something. I don't know. I'm very easy to reach over email. I will get back to you quickly. The discussion boards. Um, I'm trying to do this thing which I successfully did last semester, although I have one more class this semester. I assume it'll still work. But I basically I responded to every single discussion board post like it's an email. So if you put something on a discussion board, not only am I for sure reading it, I'm probably going to respond to it. Now I might just be like awesome, um, but I do try to respond to all of your discussion board posts. So I'm pretty present as a teacher. Um, there's a really funny story this week about a student who was taking an online class like this, and they went to contact the professor, and it turned out the professor was dead, and that someone was running the videos of the dead professor, which is just, it's ridiculous. When I die, I hope that my entire internet presence like this just, I'm gonna take it. I'm just gonna pull it into the grave with me like an Egyptian pharaoh in a tomb. Um, okay, so what else do we want to talk about? I did office hours, discussion boards, assignments, blah blah blah, reading. I think we got it. That's probably basically it, right? All right, let's talk about Shakespeare some more. I'm doing some intro stuff before we actually start Macbeth, but we will be starting Macbeth shortly. But I want to next talk about why Shakespeare matters at all. Um, Shakespeare wrote 39 plays around the year 1600 in England. Um, of those 39 plays, probably 24 of them, 23 of them are really important. Um, the important ones are very, very important. Um, they're important because they're influential. These plays changed everything. The way Shakespeare wrote meant that everybody after Shakespeare was responding or reacting in some way to Shakespeare. The reason why I think it's useful to study Shakespeare is because every time I go to the movies and every time I read recently written books, I can see little bits of Shakespeare's influence in them. For example, Macbeth is basically a horror story, and very often when I go see a horror movie like Hereditary, I'm like, oh, I see what they're doing. It's like Macbeth. The reason why so much of modern day storytelling looks the way it does is because these guys are copying these guys are copying these guys are copying these guys who copied Shakespeare. Um, so if you want to understand why the world looks the way it does, it's a good idea to know Shakespeare really well. It helps explain an awful lot of what fiction, why fiction looks the way it does, is because Shakespeare did such an amazing thing in his plays that everybody has been sort of copying him for 400 years, even if they don't 100% know it, because they're copying people who copied Shakespeare. I should say learned from Shakespeare. They're learning from people who learned from Shakespeare. Um, Shakespeare is, James Bond and how he can like shoot a gun really well, and he can also drive a car in like a race kind of situation through an obstacle course, but he can also like computer hack shit, and he can also like jump out of an airplane with a fucking parachute, and he can go do underwater shit, and he does hand-to-hand combat really well. He knows knives really. He can do everything. um, James Bond's abilities are not exactly unrealistic. There are people who can do those things like James Bond does in the movies. But the thing is that in the real world, people can only do one of those things. So there's like one guy who's really good with guns, and he's not the driver. There's one guy who's really good at driving. He doesn't do the computer hacking. There's one guy who's good at computer hacking. He doesn't do the hand-to-hand combat. There's right. So what James Bond is essentially a fantasy where one guy gets to do all the things that are normally handled by specialists who can only do the one thing. Shakespeare's a bit like that. There are writers who are as beautiful as Shakespeare. There are writers who are as funny as Shakespeare. There are writers who are philosophers in the way Shakespeare is, and I will be arguing that Shakespeare is sort of a philosopher. He has a lot of ideas. Um, there are writers who are as good thinkers as Shakespeare. There are writers who are as good psychologists as Shakespeare. Shakespeare's an excellent psychologist. He really understands how the human mind works and motivation works, especially in Macbeth. No, actually, in all the plays. We'll be talking a lot about the way Shakespeare creates. He creates characters that feel like they're three-dimensional human beings because his mastery of psychology is out of control. In fact, I would argue, if you know Sigmund Freud learned a lot from Shakespeare. And that when you're reading Freud, and so I was saying that Shakespeare influenced modern day stories. Shakespeare influenced modern day's understanding of what psychology is. Um, so anyway, there are writers that are as funny as Shakespeare, that are as entertaining as Shakespeare, as violent and sexy as Shakespeare, as thoughtful as Shakespeare, as philosophical as Shakespeare, as psychological as Shakespeare. What makes Shakespeare great is that he's the only place that does all of these things all at the same time. And that is why, and to make things better, the other reason Shakespeare's a really big deal is that because he wrote plays and not novels, his things are all short, which makes them, especially Macbeth, which is one of his shortest plays, which makes him real easy to teach. Because you can give a student a book and you can be like, here, I mean, you'll see in the printouts, you'll see them when you get down to the printouts, they squish the words really small because these were designed to physically print out and hand to students. But like Macbeth is like 20 pages. And granted, I put a lot of words in those 20 pages, but it's 20 pages long. I think it fits on like 10 or 11 pieces of paper. So Shakespeare stuff is short. And it's also pretty exciting. And there are movie versions. All of this makes it easier to teach. Because it's easy to teach, people have been teaching it for a long time, and it's this big famous thing that lots of people know about. So Shakespeare is extremely famous, and to study Shakespeare is to understand a lot of other things. It's why your assignments, paper 1 and 2 in this class, and you'll see me doing it all the time, are to link up what you've read in Shakespeare with what's going on in the outside world. This is not a history class. A lot of people, sometimes when people teach Shakespeare, they spend a lot of time quizzing students on who was the king and queen when Shakespeare was alive, and what was going on in the history context at the time. I don't really do that. I feel like there's a whole history department, and I'm very happy if they want to handle the history shit. But I majored in poetry, and I'm here to talk about the poetry shit. And Shakespeare writes better poetry than anyone who's ever lived, and so that's what I will be talking about. So that means that like I think last year I taught a Shakespeare class, and I don't know if I ever even mentioned who was king during when Macbeth was written. Actually, I did mention that. I will mention that briefly. But the point is I won't quiz you on any history shit, and I won't really be spending a lot of time on history shit. There's not a lot of dates and names to memorize. There's no memorization at all because I don't do quizzes, because quizzes are for babies. I hate quizzes. Quizzes are like the teacher says read a book, and then you go home and read the book. And then the teacher says, did you read the book? And you go, yes. And the teacher goes, I don't believe you. Prove it with a quiz. And I don't really feel like harassing my students like that. So this is not a history class. We're going to be talking about the plays and what makes them work. But we're not going to be spending a ton of time on who is king and queen and what kind of war was going on and what was going on in Shakespeare's life. That's not this class. It's not a history class. It's a literature class, and so we're going to be talking about literature, which means we're talking about the words on the page for Macbeth and Coriolanus and Romeo and Juliet. Okay. I feel like I'm wrapping up my intro. I think this is going really well. I think I'm probably going to start Macbeth in the next little video that you're going to watch in 1 minute. I don't think I have any other introductory material. Is that it? It kind of feels like it. I'm very easy to talk to. If you want to ask me questions, you can always email me, and you can talk to me on the discussion board. Why am I talking like we're finishing the lecture for the day? We're not. I just because I'm finished with the intro. And at this point, I'd be like, any questions before we start Macbeth? And I can't really ask you that because we're in the middle of a thing. But anyway, I'll figure it out as I go. We'll probably talk about Macbeth in the next video.